All right, thanks everybody for joining in today. We're going to be following up on a topic that we talked about, I think, late last year. It was going to be the pending release of Globus Connect Server version 5, and now that that's upon us, talking about what it looks like to handle the new deployment and, most importantly, the migration strategies from the older version. So this was a topic that was of a lot of interest a couple weeks ago when Globus World was held in Chicago. And I was working with Vass and with Rachana a little bit to see if we can do a talk on this for this group, since I know that this is going to apply to a lot of people. So with that, I will turn it over to Rachana, and she will go through some of the details.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Thanks everyone for joining us this Friday afternoon. I'm going to use about 45 minutes to talk about Globus Connect version 5 and migration. So I know there's a lot of interest in migration, but the strategy for migration involves setting up a vanilla version 5 server. So the first part of the presentation, I am going to talk about installing a version 5 server and begin with some concepts around version 5, which does look different from before, and then talk about migration impact, tools, and leave you with a bunch of resources for that. So I have 2 or 3 sections to it, but I am happy to get interrupted to ask to take questions. If you can put them on chat, Jason has graciously agreed to monitor that and post those questions to me. So let's see. So first, what are some of the new features in Globus Connect version 5, right? So the first one is if you are looking to do high assurance data access, whether it is CUI or PHI data handling, then version 5 is required. It is not supported in version 4. Then the next one is supporting multiple storage types on the same DTN pool. So if you have if you're using version 4 with other non-POSIX storage types, you'd have had to have separate servers. So with version 5, the architecture allows you to leverage the same DTN pool and capacity to be able to serve data from different storage types. We also moved to using OIDC for authentication. There are no user certificates in the mix. So if your campus or your institution has an OIDC server, you can use that directly and not run MyProxy or any other service that generates short-term certificates. Version 5 also supports access using HTTPS. So the same data that is accessible for bulk data movement using GridFTP can also be made accessible with the same security on HTTPS. And then lastly, if you're familiar with the long UUIDs that we use for uniquely identifying endpoints and shared endpoints, GCSv4 allows you to set custom domain names for those things so the users can find and use things like data.youruniversity.edu or something like that. Right? So these are some of the new features, but there is also a architecture change for us to be able to deliver these features. So I'm going to just quickly lay out, build out the V5 architecture and some of the new terminology so that when we go to the install piece, then it's easier for you to map on what pieces you're installing and what the steps entail. So the first concept here, I mean, we're still using data transfer nodes, so nothing is changing there, hopefully using information that ESNet has put out there for how to set up and tune DTNs. And so we're using that as the base layer. The endpoint, the software that is installed is the version 5 software or goes on each of those data transfer nodes if you have a multi-node setup. And the endpoint is the logical construct that essentially provides management and configuration interface. Unlike V4, the endpoint only provides management and configuration interface. So a user should never have to search and find an endpoint. It's an administrative piece where you set your network configuration, what concurrency and parallelism you want to use by default, and all of those things are configured at the endpoint level. You add in the connector of choice. It comes with the POSIX as a default connector, but we can also support other ones. And then you create these constructs called storage gateways. These are essentially logical constructs, again, in the Globus ecosystem that allows you to set up policy and configuration. So storage gateways determine whether it's the high assurance data needs to get handled, which means different security requirements are placed. What kind of authentication timeout, that is how often must a user authenticate to access the data, and allows you to even partition the same storage system to be able to provide different policies for access to data within that storage system. So that's one. If you are supporting additional storage types, then whether it's AWS or one of the cloud connectors or other on-prem like object stores, that connector package is then installed on those nodes, and then you create a storage gateway of that particular connector type, and then again set policy on what it takes to access that connector. So the storage gateway also is an admin construct, only the user doesn't use it. On top of that are what we are calling collections. Collections are the ones that have data access interface. So the user, essentially when they search on the Globus web app, or when they're accessing data using grid FTP or HTTPS, they are actually accessing collections. They look and smell very much like the endpoint that we have in v4. It just gives the partitioned architecture gives us a way to support different types and gives us a way to cleanly separate the interfaces that is accessed by admins and users, right? So mapped collections are very much like your host endpoints in v4. A user needs to have a local account for accessing data on those collections, and they are always tied to a particular gateway. So you have, POSIX ones or S3 ones and so on. And if you choose to enable Globus sharing on the mapped collections, then your users can create guest collections, which are the same as shared endpoints in v4, and they are able to share subset of their data with their collaborators and so on. So essentially set permissions on the data for others to access it, right? So functionality-wise, core data access functionality-wise, HTTPS is the net add, and from a user perspective, interface perspective, they're looking at terminology that is collections. And when they come to the Globus web app, when they search, they only see the collections. They will not see any of the endpoints. That's very much an administrator construct, right? So given this architecture, when you walk through the install, you literally build that out. The same architecture pieces are built out as you go through the install, right? So one big change, the first step when you do v5 is you register your endpoint, your version 5 endpoint, as a application in the Globus ecosystem. If you are a v4 user, you would have created a Globus ID and password and use that as sort of the credentials to install a v4 endpoint. With v5, you're eliminating that. There is no shared user ID password. You register an application in Globus Auth. If you're familiar with OAuth, it's a standard OAuth resource server, and it allows you to generate a client ID and secret. And this model also allows you to grant access for other administrators to be able to manage this client ID and secret, and the secret can be rotated, right? The endpoint is set up using these two, and the authentication for installing the endpoint, managing the endpoint, the admin credential, if you will, is this client ID and secret, right? So the first step takes you to developers.globus.org, and then you will see an option there to register a Globus Connect server, and you go through, essentially give it a name, and then it generates a client ID and a secret for you to use for when you install GCSv4. Second step is the standard packages. These are available in our stable repos. You will install the packages on the node. If it's I'm going to go through sort of a single DTN install, and I'll talk about what a multi-DTN looks like. So this is sort of the step of putting the packages in the right place. And then on the first DTN you're installing, you'll do a Globus Connect Server endpoint setup. It looks very similar to the v4 step, if you will, in terms of you're creating that endpoint, a logical construct in Globus. But if you notice here, the authentication uses that client ID, right? There is no Globus ID and password. And then when you run the command, it'll prompt you for the client secret to be provided. When that is done, the setup command generates a deployment key. And the client ID, secret, and the deployment key are the three pieces you need to be able to restore your endpoint, to be able to add new nodes. Like if you have a multi-DTN setup, being able to add new nodes, right? The deployment key is used to encrypt the configuration and push it to a synchronization service that we have with v5. That ensures that a change that you make on one node in a multi-DTN setup automatically is pushed to all the other nodes. If you have to start from scratch, in a sense, if you're wiping and installing completely, as long as you have those three pieces, the client ID and the secret and the deployment key, you can restore your endpoint completely, right? So there's a fully encrypted backup and synchronization that is built in for v5. You do not need a shared file system like we did in the previous version. So the creation of the endpoint is a one-time activity. You create one endpoint, and then every DTN that you want to add is a node. So you would go in and do the second command here, Globus Connect Server node setup with the client ID, and it'll prompt you for the client passcode, the key, and then also the deployment key.json, which Globus cannot restore, has no access to. That's something that's local at the site, right? So when you're done with that, this is kind of where your setup is, right? You've created a logical construct, and you have one node where GCS is installed, and you have an endpoint with a single DTN. And if you want to add more DTNs, then you would essentially run the node setup command with the deployment key.json. Then the next step in that next layer is the storage gateway, right? Assuming it's POSIX, your connector software is already there on the node, so the GCS ships with the POSIX connector. If you're doing any other storage type, then you would make sure that the connector is installed here as well, right? Then to create a storage gateway, what we need to, there are some additional commands you will run, but let's first talk about what does storage gateway provide, right? What do you need to be thinking about when you're creating a storage gateway? It essentially defines a set of access policies for the data. The first one are first set of policies are authentication policies. So what domains do you accept? About 90% of the deployments we have has a single domain. You usually have, for example, for us, it's at uchicago.edu, right? Is MFA required to access data via the storage gateway? What is the authentication timeout? That is, how often must a user authenticate with the Globus ecosystem to start new data access activities? And then is it used for protected data? So is it used for PHI, CUI? And if it is, then configuration for that, right? So these are the kinds of policies, authentication policies that a storage gateway supports. It also has configuration for identity mapping. So if a user authenticates, let's say someone comes in with Rachana at uchicago.edu, then how does that get mapped to a local account, right? I'll talk some more about this, but that's also something that is configured at the storage gateway. There are some automated ways, but it's fully customizable, and you can decide how that mapping happens. Then the second one is data access policy. Which parts of the storage system are accessible via Globus through this storage gateway? You can also essentially have allow and deny lists of local accounts who can access data via this, right? So all of this policy is configured at the storage gateway. And again, it's an admin construct and not something a user ever sees. So let's talk a little bit about identity domains. I mentioned that we have moved away from requiring X509 certificates for users, and you can use an OpenID Connect server for authentication, right? Which means that the identity coming into Globus with version 5 is actually looks very much like the identity you use when you log into your university accounts, right? It's some username at a domain.edu. It's not an X509 certificate. These are assertions that come in, right? So when you configure a domain on a storage gateway, you can configure one of the domains that are supported in the Globus federated list. So if you go to app.globus.org, that drop down that you see when you log in, any of those can be added. You can include one of the OIDC servers that you're already running in your at your institution as something that a user must authenticate with, or you can install an OIDC server that Globus ships and connect it to your authentication of choice, right? If you don't have an OIDC server already, or you don't want to have your university's login mechanism, then you can configure that to be used with this. So this essentially replaces my proxy OAuth if that's what you're using in your v4 list. And then you need to map that identity to a local account. Most people who are using federated login via INCOM and NCR logon, essentially the everything after the is essentially removed, and that's the local account, right? So if I'm Rachana at uchicago.edu, then on the mapped collection that is there at UChicago, my local account is Rachana. So that's a default one. It automatically gets synchronized and everything. But obviously people have custom ways of mapping, and there is an identity mapping option that essentially lets you customize that however you want. The option there gives the whole security context. You get all of the users' linked identities, their email, and you can essentially use that information to determine what the local account is. Or if you have, if you need to do call outs to other services to get the local account information, that's possible as well, right? Again, vast majority will use the first option we have there. The majority of the deployments end up using that, but for those customized deployments, you can also use you sort of do your own processing of the security context to determine what the local identity is, right? I'm just going to pause here. This is a section we get most questions on, and admins are thinking hard about what this might look like for them. Are there any questions, comments at this point?
None so far in the chat room, but certainly if people do have them, type them in and I can repeat them.
Okay, I'll keep going. And there is we'll share this deck out, and there are sort of specific guides for the various steps in this. So if identity mapping is going to be the piece where you need a lot of customization, there is a detailed documentation on how to do this, along with example scripts as well. So I'm just going to go back here. So these are the questions you want to answer when you're thinking about building a storage gateway. What is the authentication policy? What is the identity mapping policy and data access policy? This is the same thing you would have configured in V4. It's just, it was all set up in that one document as a part of the endpoint. We're just pulling that out as a storage gateway piece, right? So it's not anything new at all. The new piece is really this one, where you don't have certificates and you have an identity that you're mapping. So that's the only piece that will look different from version 4. So this is the command to create a storage gateway. You decide the connector type. So the default is POSIX, but like I said, any of the connectors we support, you give it a name, you decide which domain or domains a user needs to authenticate from, and then the authentication timeout, how often do they want to authenticate? And if I had custom policies in terms of how I was doing mapping, then I would provide that as well here, right? So that's how a storage gateway gets created. So this is about where you will be when you finish those two steps. So you'd have an endpoint, you have potentially multiple nodes on the endpoint, and if you've created a storage gateway, and the one I'm highlighting sort of is something that's been created for /scratch, right? So you can decide what part of the file system it needs to support. So all of this that I've discussed thus far is an admin function only. The user never does any of this or sees any of this, right? So then the next step is to create a mapped collection. This is how you are granting access or providing that data access interface for the users. Essentially, you say which storage gateway you want to create it on, what file path, what part of the file system it's rooted in, and then a name of the mapped collection. Now, this name, the string here that says my APS mapped collection, is the one that a user is going to find and discover when they search in the Globus web app, right? So this is the part that you're starting to expose to a user. So that's the storage gateway ID, the base path, and the name, right? There's several things you can configure. The line I like to say, anything you can do with V4, you can do with V5. So if you have restrictions on your map collections, especially POSIX ones in terms of local users and local groups who are allowed to access, you can configure that. You can force data channel encryption, integrity checks, so you can have all of those configurations, right? So everything translates over to this. So once you're done with it, this is sort of the red box is what we just added. We added a mapped collection. A user can then come in, they have to authenticate, meet the authentication timeout and the domain requirement, must have a mapped account. So they must map to a valid local account and then essentially transfer data out, right? It obviously looks different if it is a different connector, but that's the most common one with POSIX. The last couple of slides here on just the install, if you use premium features, then you would associate a subscription ID with the endpoint. So the first construct that we set, right? So a subscription manager can associate that just like it is done today. If the subscription manager doesn't have access to the install, or there are two different people, then you would send your endpoint ID and they can set it as managed, right? That gives them access to all of the premium features, including the non-POSIX connectors and such. So then you can enable features. On the mapped collection, you can allow sharing, which is where a user can come in and create a guest collection and set permissions for subsets of the data to be accessed by others. You can restrict that sharing just like you do it with V4. You can decide who can share, what parts of the file system they're allowed to share, whether you can disable anonymous access. So there's a lot of controls around the whole sharing from an admin perspective. And you can also enable HTTPS access. So there are some people who do not want to allow that access, but that is also an option on the mapped collection. So you can allow for data to be accessed either using grid FTP or HTTPS, right? So these are some of the features on the mapped collection that are enabled by making the whole endpoint a managed endpoint. And to add a new storage system, it looks pretty much the same. On the node, you would add the required GCS package. So the connector package, if you're doing OneDrive or Google Drive, you would add that connector package. Essentially set up a storage gateway. A storage gateway can only have one type. So you have to add another storage gateway. And then the configuration options will look different. It doesn't look like POSIX, right? So it'll look different based on the storage gateway, but the command line walks you through all of that. And then from a user perspective, the mapped collection that is sitting on that also will look different. So if it is S3, I might need to provide a key. If it is Google Drive, I will get prompted to authenticate using Google OAuth and come back with tokens. So the user experience depends very much on the storage system. But from an admin perspective, the policies are quite similar. There's authentication and data access policies. Okay, so that's installing. There's a detailed document for the install. There is a quick start guide if all you're doing is a single DTN POSIX. That's very quick to do as well. And then there are separate guides for various things, and I'll leave resources there. I don't see any questions on chat. Anybody? I don't know if people can unmute, but are there any questions, anything I can answer on the install before I shift to migration?
Don't see any questions yet. If anybody does have any, either type them in or raise your hand, and we can certainly unmute you and do it that way too.
Okay.
Nope, looks like we're good.
You're good? Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, so for those of you who have V4, we are ready for you to move as long as your endpoint, we are ready for you to move a vast majority. Those of you who have a large number of guest collections are the ones where the migration tools still need some work, but for most other deployments, we are ready for moving. So what were the goals when we sought out to build out automated migration or migration tools? The first thing was that there should be no user intervention required. So that means even if you have guest collections or shared endpoints in V4, which a user creates, that the user should not have to come in and essentially recreate any of those things, right? And then from an admin perspective, we wanted to try to see how we can preserve all your relevant configuration. So it sort of, copies everything over and so on. We also are looking at, we also have support for preserving UUIDs. So this was important, right? If in the Globus ecosystem, the unique way to identify an endpoint is using the UUID. And there are applications and integrations that have been built that use a particular endpoint, and they have sort of these connections that would be hard to migrate. So this was something that came as user feedback saying, we definitely want to make sure that we are preserving all of those things. And of course, minimize downtime, right? Eliminate is not an option because of this preserving UUIDs, but minimize it as much as possible. So these were sort of the key goals as we approached migration and built out the migration tooling itself, right? So given the migration tooling and the process, I want to touch a little bit on impact. What does it look like for you when you go through the migration, right? I'll explain the migration process, but the final step of the migration, where your old endpoints UUID is moved over to the new one, definitely requires a downtime, right? So that's when it is going to pull down your endpoint, and it's going to require some downtime when that happens. Actually, before I go to the next one, if you have a multi-DTN setup, then your downtime is restricted to just this. So you can pull one server out of your V4 deployment, upgrade it to V5, test everything, and then you do your finalize step, at which point you take a downtime. If you have a single DTN and that's the same server, then the minute you install V5, you're going to start your downtime at that time. So it's going to vary on that. All active transfers, when that finalize steps happens, all active transfers will be canceled by the system and users will be notified. It was extremely onerous, or not even onerous. It was a risky move to try to move that over when we are moving resources in the backend, and we didn't want any integrity issues. So your users will sort of see that canceled, and they will get notified from the system that it was canceled because of migration. If you have pause rules, which I know some users use for maintenance and migration and management, those pause rules will not be preserved. They have to be recreated on V5. So from an admin perspective, that is something that you're impacted on. And then any application that was using a V4 host endpoint will have to move to using V5 with consent. So the application has to deal with the fact that we are not doing certificates anymore, but rather doing OIDC consent. Our SDK and the Python SDK Globus ships has already support for all of this. So it's not too onerous to make the move, but they have to, right? A vast majority of the applications don't use host endpoints because it requires user intervention and automation is a challenge. Most of them use shared endpoints. In that case, there is no impact at all. That'll just move to guest collections and everything will work as it is. But if you have an application that does speak to a host endpoint, then the application author has to make some changes. Essentially changes activation to consent. And there is a guide that walks them through what the changes are with reference to things in our SDK. So if you're using our Python SDK, then it's pretty quick to make that change, right? So this is impact. We have really tried our best to minimize downtime, but from your perspective, if you're doing this for your enterprise or your campus, this is best done announced as a downtime, and then getting the endpoint migrated and then bringing it back up, right? Now, so there is a migration guide and tooling that we have provided, and I'll walk through what that looks like from your perspective. But essentially, these tools, for a large part, the idea is to read the configuration of your V4 and apply it to a vanilla V5, right? So that's why I started this presentation by explaining what installing a vanilla V5 looks like. But that's really what you're doing. You're going to install a blank V5 with no configuration. And then the tooling reads your V4 and configures it to look exactly the same. So the first step here is to create a migration plan. So once you get install the migration tools, you want to install it on the node where V4 is running. Running this migration plan will not affect your V4. You could do this today and there'll be no issues there, right? And the first thing you do is you say GCS migration create. And what the tooling is doing, it is going through your V4 configuration and creating a plan. It spits out a bunch of documents in YAML that essentially has the configuration all parsed out for it to create a plan of what your deployment looks like, right? This will require that you be an admin on that, as in the person running this must have the Globus ID and password of V4. So an admin must run it so that we can read all the configuration. It's a read-only step, does not affect anything on your V4 deployment, and then it spits a bunch of documents, right, that has information about the state. So that's step number one. Then there is a migration check command. When you run that, the command actually looks through all that file, all the configuration, and flags anything that needs your attention. So for standard installs, we will be able to move most of it without you intervening. But for example, in this one, it flags the idea that the mapping, which was from an X509 certificate to a local account, we are not able to translate that without support from an admin, right? So it flags it. You notice that the flag actually has an error code. And if you go to our migration document, the error code explains how you resolve it. In this case, you have to pick the domain that you want to use on the gateway rather than the certificate, right? So the check command essentially flags each of these, so you can, wherever we cannot automatically move and an admin intervention is required, we ask those questions here. Again, this only makes changes to the plan, nothing on your V4 deployment, right? This is getting it ready, the configuration ready for V5. So in that, for this error, essentially, it tells you to look at this file and it says there are multiple mappings and we need to make sure that the domains are clearly specified. And once you fix this, you say the domains are uchicago.edu. And then when you run the check command, it's going to say pass the check, right? I expect that for many of the deployments, the identity mapping is the one you'll spend time on, and we must be able to move most of it over. The big caveat are deployments that are very old, deployments that have been around for over 10, 12 years or haven't kept up in upgrades, or deployments that don't use Globus Connect Server and use the direct toolkit. Those are going to require some administrators handling it, because all the migration tool is assuming is built based on the Globus Connect Server version 4 deployment, right? So there are some corner cases here. Grid FTP has a lot of options, and if you know how to directly make those edits, it might be hard to find that in this migration tool check. But it essentially flags everything, and then when you run the check again, it kind of says what it looks like. The few people, so we have had these migration tools around for a little while. The few people who have filed support tickets on these usually have something like this, where they have a Grid FTP feature they are maybe directly using, and we ask them to send us their migration plan so we can tell exactly what needs to be changed, and we support that, right? So that's been a few cases of where people have had support requests come through. Once you've essentially gotten a clean migration check run, right? You've resolved everything, looks right. Then you run the migrate 4 command, and that essentially applies the V4 configuration to your V5 install. So I guess I should have said before this step, you will install V5 on that machine, and it essentially reads your all the configuration and applies it to your V5 install. So if you had a mapped collection, it creates one. If you had 50 guest collections owned by various users, and along with ACLs and permissions on those, it recreates all of that on the V5 install, right? At this point, the V5 install is fully functional. As an admin, you can test it. You can go make sure that all the configuration looks right. You're able to move data. And the only thing is that this V5 install has a different ID. The UUID looks different, and it's not the same one as your V4. And that's the last step. On the last step, you run Finalize. Actually, I have the wrong screenshot here. You run Finalize on this, and all it does is it calls the Globus transfer service, authenticates, and asks for the UUID to get moved over, right? At the end of this, now, when people go to the same collection, the same or talk to the same endpoint, it essentially is now using V5 and reuses the UUID. Right? So those are the steps for the migration. I guess I missed a screenshot on install. So before you run migrate, you will do a vanilla install like I walked through, right? And install only needs to be of the endpoint. You're not going to create storage gateways or map collections. You just do the first step in the installation that I described, and then the command, migrate command, make sure that it creates all the storage gateways, the map collections, and if there are any guest collections, all of that is created from reading your V4, right? So all you have to get to is be able to just install that basic endpoint, the first step in the installation. So that's the finalized piece, and that essentially completes a migration here. I have a bunch of resources The first one here talks about installing V5, just vanilla install, and walks through all the steps there. Second one is the migration guide homepage. It has all of that information, and the application migration. So the steps for being able to actually migrate an application that you might want to give to people on your campus who might have portals or automation. But typically automation doesn't use host endpoints, so I'm not too concerned about that. It's more of the interactive applications that may have been developed using a map collection. They will need to do the application migration itself. Right? So that's about the content I had. I was planning for a lot more questions than we got here. So I'll stop and see if there are questions I can answer.
Well, thank you for going through that process. I'll put out the open call again. If anybody does have a question that they'd rather verbally ask, just raise your hand and I can unmute you, or type it in and we can go that way. I guess I'll also maybe put out a poll question to get people to participate a little bit here. Who is running Globus right now at your sites, and will this impact you? So Stephen asks, is there anything special we need to do to migrate from CI login?
Actually, that is the easiest. I assume you're running a V4 endpoint that has CI logon as the authentication method, and you have a configuration that says the user must authenticate from a particular domain. So in that case, your identity mapping is automatically taken care of if your mapping is default, right? So when you run through the migration tool, it is going to detect that. It's going to confirm that you want to use that particular domain, your university domain. And once you say yes, then it sets up the gateway and the map collections automatically. The follow-up question is interesting. If you are using V4 with the grid map, then you have to be able to figure out how to go from, if you're going from X509 to a local account, you have to be able to go from the user identity to a local account. So that is going to require you to think about how you want to map a user identity to a local account rather than X509, right? The question we cannot answer is sort of what the policy is. And it might be simply that you maintain a list somewhere, or there is an LDAP with mapping and you have to do a call out, or there is a programmatic way to extract that information. Say you can take all my identities and extract the local account information from there, then you can write that in as an option in GCS5, or you could do a lookup to either a flat file or some other service as well.
All right, and I did allow people to unmute themselves if you feel comfortable just asking your question instead of typing it in. So maybe just raise your hand before you do so that we don't collide with each other. Yeah, maybe a really quiet group today. Well, so I guess I'll just put out another polling question here for those of you that do run this at your home institution. Have you already migrated to V5? If anybody is in that camp, certainly maybe speak up.
I have a feeling, this is Derek Simmel, we migrated one V4 endpoint to a V5 manually for a specific project that has a licensed Globus endpoint. And that seems to have worked fine. As far as I know, there haven't been complaints, so we're happy with that. I don't know whether the tools were available yet, but fortunately what they were using before translated when the upgrade was complete. So again, it's still working and nobody's complaining. So I'm going to call that a success.
Yes. Thanks, Derek. So so there are ultimately, because the tooling is doing sort of automatic read and set of the configuration, some admins have said, I'm just going to install a new one. and I can do the configuration myself. It wasn't very complicated. So some of them have gone that route and then just pulled down their v4. We've had a couple like that. And if you don't need those UUIDs preserved, like if you don't need somebody knowing your endpoint ID coming back and making sure that it remains the same, then you could go the path of just setting up a new v5 and pulling down a v4, right? I don't remember which endpoint, migration you're talking about, but the tools have been around for a couple of months now.
Yeah, I think this was early at the beginning of the year, and this was
Okay.
for HubMap.
HubMap, okay, yeah, no, they did a
HubMap.
manual setup and pull down because because for them, the host endpoint, they use only their portal users, and their users
Right.
just use shared endpoint. So they didn't have a concern about preserving anything there.
Right. It looks like Michael Lambert has a question about IPv4
Yeah, so
versus.
I'll read that out. Am I correct that Globus is IPv4 versus IPv6 agnostic?
Not quite. We work with IPv4, IPv6 compatibilities on the roadmap for this year.
All right. Anybody have any other questions that they'd like to ask? And we will certainly be posting these slides in the recording so that you can share this with others.
So maybe I'll ask one more question that came up at a Globus World. I was encouraged to set a deadline for when v4 will not be supported. We haven't done that yet. We are waiting to see community adoption and some migration and all of that. So I'd be interested if anybody in this group, if we would ideally like to see if we can get everyone migrated over and sort of deprecate and discontinue by end of this year, or at least first quarter of next year. Anybody here have thoughts or comments on timelines, or if you already have plans for when you'll be migrating?
While everybody is ruminating on that, Stephen has another question. Does the endpoint need to be a DTN?
The endpoint is installed on any server that has access to the file system, and ideally is well connected for moving data in and out. I hope I'm reading that question right. So you could install the DTN, you could install the endpoint on a different server, but typically you want to ensure that it's set up to be able to deal with data volumes and set up for performance.
So I'm going to expand on that a little bit. I work with Steve. We're both at UCF. So part of our problem is that at the moment, our science DMZ at UCF is set up in such a way that what you can access from it is very limited. So you can, right now, the IP addresses on our science DMZ are only advertised at Internet 2. And we currently have our ACLs pretty locked down. So with the current setup where it's using certificates and stuff for authentication, that works well enough. We just, every once in a while have to switch over to commodity internet to download the CRLs to get the updated CRLs. But then otherwise we don't need to have access to the commodity internet. But with this change, we're wondering how we're going to be impacted by that.
So even with v4 though, I guess, so sorry, just to make sure, on install, you are still reaching out to the AWS service, right? To be able to.
Right,
So,
but
so
at the moment we
Go
have
ahead.
to manually switch what network we're connected to connect to all the stuff that's in AWS, to download the CRLs and all that kind of stuff. And then we switch back over to our science DMZ, which is Internet 2 only and does not have access to the AWS stuff.
Okay. I think you should, so once the install is complete, the model for how the data access happens and all of that looks the same. So you need connectivity to the Globus transfer service for control channel. Data channel goes directly to the other endpoint. So I don't think we have changed any of those things. So I think it will look the same. The new part is the authentication. So it sort of depends on when the, actually I take that back. The authentication happens with the Globus auth service, not with your DTN. So when a user comes to your mapped collection and you say you have to authenticate with, domain, your university domain, they just go to your OIDC server wherever you run it, or your university IDP, and an assertion is set. So that doesn't impact your DTN configuration. So I think the model hasn't changed in ways that would impact whatever you're doing today. But I will also take this back to the team and ask the question, and if there's anything, reach back out to you, or if you want to drop us an email on support@Globus on what you're doing, we can confirm that this change, the way you're running it, will not be affected, but will not need modifications for V5.
Right, because my main concern is with the authentication piece, because I don't know what the endpoint needs to be able to talk to for the authentication to work successfully. Because with certificates, it doesn't have to necessarily talk to a server; it just has to check that the certificate is valid. So that's why I'm not super familiar with OpenID and how all of that works. So that's just kind of where my
so the user authentication happens with Globus auth service, not the endpoint, and then the endpoint gets an assertion from the Globus auth service on the user identity, right? But you probably have already set it up because you're talking to the transfer service, so it is set up for talking to the cloud hosted service. So I think it should work the same way. So that's how the assertion flows. So based on just this discussion, I think the model hasn't changed enough to force a modification from your side, but it would be good if you could just drop us an email with some information, and we can confirm that for you even before you start your migration path.
Right.
Rachana, sorry, just to jump in, I wonder if this is, Jamie, maybe you can confirm this. Are you coming from an environment where you used to explicitly limit routing to the CIDR block that we used to publish when V4 was around on Amazon?
So
that's it.
That was a little bit before my time here. I didn't actually set up this endpoint, but I believe it was something like that. And then once all of the like Globus service stuff moved from being on site with you guys to being in AWS, then that was when we started having to do the flip-flopping of the networks and stuff on a regular basis.
Okay, like Rachana
I mean,
said,
massive. Right. So sorry, I was just going to say, if they are set up to talk to the transfer service and are not using the CIDR block, then they should be okay, because the OAuth flow is not from GCS, right?
Right.
Jimmy, I'm sorry, it will change if you use any of the cloud connectors or anything like that, then it's different, because now you're suddenly talking to lots of other services from that. But for basic POSIX, it shouldn't be different.
Okay. Yeah, so when we're ready to really start working on this, then we'll drop you guys a line, and we'll confirm everything and go from there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sounds good. Derek?
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
So this sounds very much like what I'm hearing from fellow service providers in Exceed. Some of whom are still operating legacy, Globus 6, Globus Community Toolkit based grid FTP with grid map files and X509 based authentication as their primary means of authenticating users. And although we have so far had an OA4MP bridge, to get between, say, Exceed or and also the CI logon based similar service. Perhaps, do you have pointers to guidance for, hey, you're trying to go from X509 to, Globus auth. So here's how you have to do things different, and this is what you're going to need to get from your users to do a mapping correctly, or do you have any kind of guidance like that that's maybe published that we can point to?
Yeah, No, good question. So, ultimately, even if we ran bridging services, what Globus was receiving was X509 certs. So the identity mapping guide, I think, speaks to what is needed in the new tech. It talks about, what
Okay.
security context you get, if you will, right? And that
Right.
is what that information is available for you to map to a local account. We have had some conversations, for example, in some groups, the idea that they get the username was sufficient. They were able to look up to figure out what the local account was. So I would say you start with the identity mapping guide and look through that and see. I think Vash just posted a link to see what the old security context was, your X509 certificate and the non-critical assertions in it, right? That's what was available for you to determine your mapping. The new
Right.
one is all the users linked identity plus the email context that is there, along with authentication timestamps, MFA, and all of that information. And then that needs to go into that needs to get mapped to a local account. So I would suggest looking through that and seeing if that gives you enough context to answer that question. I don't believe there is a way to do anything turnkey because every campus or every deployment has some
Right.
mapping method, right? I mean, in Xseed, we had AMI packets. So yes, there's a way to do that, but there's no way to say if you are using X509 to grid map for mapping, here is a tool that lets you convert, because you're now going to go from identity to there. So I suggest starting from there, Derek, and please don't hesitate to contact us. Even if you're not planning on migrating soon, even if you have questions around that, we would be happy to discuss what you need.
Yeah, if
mapping
nothing
and
else, I
how
just
to-
wanted to give you a heads up that this might be coming hard
Yeah.
and fast this summer when SPs realize, oh crap, we really do have to do something else now. So I know that this is on the minds of people. I have been looking through your documentation and so forth for our own setup, but this will be a common thing. So I was just hoping that there might be a shortcut for, yeah, we've had this question before, and here's the guide for getting you from here to there, and we could.
Unfortunately, that's that part of security that we can't automate, right? Like going from an X509 insert to a local DN in a grid map file is such a specific piece. But I also want to say there are, like you said, I think some large SPs that have been running for a number of years have a vast majority of the deployments are using OIDC servers or their own OIDC deployments or CI logon, in which case the mapping has been mostly sort of that, my local account is already there, because they moved to just allowing that federated ID. So hopefully that crowd is taken care of. But I agree with you that there are some large deployments where there are actual grid map files, and we need to figure out how to move that over.
Yeah,
and that there has to be a partnership.
In our particular environment, or at least across Xseed, we're not talking about installing necessarily for my local campus's user base, right? It's thousands of people from all over the world, and we got to figure out what their particular local institution, CI logon, whatever it is, right, that we need to map is, and gathering that information is probably the biggest challenge for us.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I understand. I mean, we could potentially, if there is enough interest and if we can get some requirements there, we could think about supporting ways for you to get both those pieces of information, right? Having a user authenticate with their cert and an identity, so you get that mapping. But like I said, there is no way to sort of provide a turnkey solution, because that mapping.
We're expecting a registration process to be necessary to somehow capture that from the users. But I guess the first question would be, what exactly am I asking them for? Do I ask them just to log in to CI logon, and then, because that's sort of what we did with their certificate subject and CI logon before, is we said, hey, log in to CI logon and tell us the subject string. So the next question would be, what do I ask them to tell me now? Or do I set up something where they authenticate and I capture something as a matter of, through some interface or some API that gives me what I need?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the what you need is that certificate and the identity, right? I think it is embedded in. Actually, I should go look at the CI logon certificate. If my identity name, that is, Rachana@uchicago.edu, if that is available in the certificate, then you kind of have my identity. And you can
I have some recollection that email is not a part of your certificate, and that's a matter of certificate
Right.
standards. Not supposed to put
Correct.
email.
So this is not email. This is my username at UChicago. That's not
Oh,
the
I
same
see.
as
I'm sorry.
I mean,
Your IDP is.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Because that is somewhere embedded. That's kind of what we use to extract as a non-critical assertion from which we extract some things. So these are good questions. So maybe I can reach out to you offline. It would be great to hear from others who you think are affected by this as well. So we can think about if there is sort of a, like you said, a mapping application that we can make available that allows the users to authenticate. What you need is for them to tell you their certificate and their identity, I think. So if we can do something like that, we are happy to work with you on that as well.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And then one other person had a comment, Ken Miller, if you want to ask yours.
Yeah, we were actually setting up a new node just yesterday, and we ran into a couple issues. We had the subnet allocated. We have pretty tight ACLs on the public side of things, but what we ran into is some of the registration was hitting various CloudFront IP addresses. And so I don't know if that's part of the registration or part of the AWS piece you're talking about, or maybe we are still using the old subnet. So that could be on our end. That's why we haven't opened the ticket yet, but we just ran into this yesterday. So
so the registration, this
Go ahead.
registration potentially could, Ken, because that goes to Globus Auth, not to
Okay.
others. But if you run into issues, yeah, please let us know. If you could give us some
Yeah,
details, that would be great.
We weren't 100% sure if it was our ACLs or our local host routing and things like that yet, but we had to do Wiresharks to try to figure out what IPs were open so we could open those up, and we got it working and it's up and running in Starlight now, but we just wanted to double check that on our end first. So thanks. I'll make sure we check out the auth piece and get those IPs out there.
Yeah, let us know if you need more info on that as well. But the registration stuff goes to Globus Auth.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that was it for the questions, and we're at the top of the hour. So thanks again to the Globus team for answering the questions, and we'll make sure we get those slides posted. We're going to be on a 1-week pause, and then we have a talk that was just scheduled for the 24th. It's from Otto Whitner, and he is going to be talking about a monitoring project called Migrate. And I will send out some information on that shortly. So hope everybody has a good weekend, and we'll talk to everybody soon.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.